1 o'clock. Good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Brenda Shaffer, a senior advisor at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, join us to discuss Exposing the Persian Empire. Professor Shaffer will speak for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Dr. Brenda Shaffer. Sorry, you're muted still.
Hello, thank you for joining this discussion. So, time and time again, we look at foreign countries and often have the image that ruling regimes, ruling governments try to portray. So, for instance, through the period, most of the Soviet period, US media referred to the people in the Soviet Union as the Russians. We thought that pretty much Russification of the minorities was a fact. We had Yugoslavia, suddenly very surprised when it breaks up and see that there are individual countries, communities, cleavages in the country. Syria, again, a surprise, how polarized most of the society is. And the case is clearly also with the case of Iran, which many refer to as Persians, think of it as Persian music, Persian culture. But Iran itself is a multi-ethnic country where at least 50% of the population is non-Persian minorities. Not only are the non-Persian, not only is there a huge population that isn't ethnically Persian, but most of the ethnic minorities are concentrated in Iran's border provinces, and most of them have co-ethnic ties to members of their group across the border. So for instance, you have most of northwest Iran populated by ethnic Azerbaijanis. Over the border, you have Azerbaijan. You have Kurds in also in northwest and central west Iran. Over the border, Kurds in Iraq and in Turkey. So this is clear on every border of Iran. And what I learned through looking at even Iranian data that was used in this study, Iran is more than Persia, which was published by FDD, and it's a part of a forthcoming book that I'm researching right now on ethnic minorities in Iran. Not only are there, as over half the population of Iran, ethnic minorities, but 40% in internal Iranian polling data, government data, claim to not be fully fluent in Persian. So, this is a tremendous numbers, and probably the real numbers are higher because often people in polls are a bit ashamed, to say something negative about themselves. So it means probably close to the population of Iran isn't even fluent in Persian. In this report, actually, Dr. Pipes and I, for years, we've been discussing also in different publications, the numbers of ethnic minorities in Iran. And unfortunately, most of Western scholarship has relied on the CIA old versions of the CIA fact book, that even the CIA fact book stopped publishing these numbers because they didn't have a clear picture. But people still refer to the old ones, which were somewhat debunked. But I decided, as a baseline, let's start with Iranian government internal data on the ethnic minorities, because we know this is likely going to be actually would strengthen the Persian numbers, or the amount of assimilation, right, and not the opposite. And what I found by looking at Iranian government data itself, that they themselves report that over half of the population of Iran is the ethnic minorities. So they know they have a problem. They know they have this issue. Iran's ethnic minorities inhabit Iran's poorest provinces, and Iran's growing environmental challenges, which are life-threatening environmental challenges, whether it's toxic waste from the oil and gas industry in Khuzestan region, which is populated mainly by Awazi Arabs, whether it's water shortages, throughout Iran, especially affecting the Baluch and the Kurds. So these environmental health challenges disproportionately affect the ethnic minorities in Iran. Well, we see this, this last major wave of demonstrations, 2017, that started in 2017, reemerged in the winter 2019, you see that this was not happening mostly in Tehran and the Persian populated cities, but it was happening in Iran's provinces among the ethnic minorities. For instance, a major center of this was the Khuzestan region, which is again is inhabited mainly by Arabs, by Awazis, and they huge number of deaths and killings, during these protests. It's kind of funny that, although we're in this period in the West of ethnic politics and social media is really, facilitating connection between ethnic groups that don't necessarily share territory or share states, for some reason, researchers think that this wave is going to somehow not affect Iran, but it's exact opposite, that I think you're seeing a greater ethnic awareness among the younger generation, even ones that are more proficient in Persian than their parents and grandparents, but maybe because they're more higher education level and aware of, interacting in modern technology, I think you're seeing an increased wave of ethnic identity, again, not dissimilar to something that we're seeing in the West right now. And also foreign television. So most of the ethnic minorities don't watch Persian language television, whether it's the regime's television or whether it's opposition television or even US sponsored Voice of America television. They're watching television in their own languages. So this means Azerbaijanis are watching Turkish television and television from the Republic of Azerbaijan, and also foreign Azerbaijani language TV station based in Chicago. Kurds are watching television made in Kurdish, mainly from Europe and from Iraqi Kurdistan. Arabs are watching television that's from the Gulf or Arabic language broadcasts that are commercial broadcasts from the US, from Europe, but they're not watching Iranian television. And again, they're not watching even the Iranian opposition television. In some of the regions, ethnically populated regions, since late 2017, the anti-regime activities entered a new stage, a violent period. We see this with in Khuzestan, among the Kurds, among the Baluch, where really military attacks on IRGC, on Iranian military, completely new stage. A big question will actually be the attitudes of the Azerbaijani community in Iran. One, they're the largest ethnic group, ethnic minority outside the Persians, probably about a third of the population. Actually, because they're relatively to the other groups, to groups like Kurds, Baluch, and Arabs, they're relatively integrated into the regime. But even here, it seems to be a shift. And this is something akin to, Ukraine suddenly pulling out of the Soviet Union, right? So something that was maybe a cornerstone of Russia's control over the Soviet space, like Ukraine, suddenly we might be seeing some changes with the Azerbaijani community in Iran. And this, I believe, was affected by the 2020 war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where Iran clearly supported Armenia. All the military equipment that came from Russia doesn't share a border with its ally Armenia. So all the military equipment supplied during the war from Russia to Armenia went through Iranian ports on Zali and then taken by trucks into the war zone into Armenia, or by planes. And you could really see it clearly, all the Russian flights over the Caspian, into Iran, and then over to Armenia. So, because they couldn't overfly Georgia or obviously Azerbaijan and Georgia into Armenia. So Iran was integral to this war, and Iranian Azerbaijanis saw this, and I think this is somewhat of a break for many of them with the ruling regime. Iran goes to great lengths to suppress its ethnic minorities. Not only are they not allowed to use the languages in schools and government offices, but they even recently started to invade the language use in the homes. So now kids, when they arrive at first grade in Iran, they're tested for their Persian proficiency. If it's not high enough, they're sent to special education as either kids with hearing problems or intellectually challenged. considered children with disabilities versus kids that just don't speak Persian. So this is forcing a lot of parents to start teaching children Persian at home before they enter school. And that's, a real evasion of the government, into the home. Iran's ethnic minorities have the highest rates of incarceration, of judicial execution. Highest are the Kurds. Also high in the numbers are Awazis and Baluch, but all the ethnic minorities. So I hope U.S. government will start taking more of an interest in this issue. The ethnic minorities, all the representatives have called to boycott the June 18th elections, and I think that will be a big test. I envision there's going to be a lot of anti-regime activity after these elections, especially if they're boycotted. And if we're concerned about, it's very interesting, like a lot of the human rights organizations follow the status of religious minorities in Iran. Of course, I wish them well and it's important, but they're 1% of the population of Iran. The ethnic minorities are over 50%. The real human rights issue is what's happening to the ethnic minorities. So I'm happy to open this up to discussion and to questions, and thank you again to the Middle East Forum for hosting this.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So the first question we have in is, what are the differences and similarities between the Arabs and the Iranians? Minorities.
Yeah, the Arabs in Iran, which call themselves Awazis, the specific group, they number about 5 million. Most of them are focused in the Khuzestan province and Bandar Abbas areas. So these are two really critically strategic areas of Iran for both oil production, gas and oil pipeline junctures, major roads, major ports. So the Iranian data, I believe, really under reports how many ethnic Arabs they have in the country because they sit at these strategic junctures. And you would be surprised that you would think in the Islamic Republic there would be some kind of respect for the language of the Quran, for the language of the Prophet, but actually. Iranian Arabs are not allowed to educate their children in the Arabic language. They can study Arabic language as a foreign language, and that you have throughout schools in Iran, but it can't be a language of instruction. And if kids, speak to the teacher in Arabic, who was probably also a native Arabic speaker herself, they're hit, they're punished, if you look at, for instance, all the oil and gas industries in Khuzestan, all the top, white collar jobs go to Persians, which are there's even like settler programs to bring in non-Arabs to the region. And what the Arab gets are the low paying jobs, the pollution, the toxic waste, from this industry, huge, awful health consequences to this population in Iran.
Thank you. From Sandro Bellestrino. Do ethnic minorities vote in Iran? You were just talking about a boycott. Can you explain that a little further?
So the June 18th is the presidential elections, and leadership of all the ethnic groups, so all of them, Kurds, Azerbaijanis, Arabs, Baluch, I believe even the northerners, from Gilan, Mazaran, have called to boycott the elections. So. And this is in addition to the mainstream, pro-democracy or anti-regime elements abroad that have called for the boycott. So I think it'll be a very interesting test if we see that the numbers are lower participation among the ethnic minorities than in the center. And of course, the regime doesn't always report accurate numbers, but I think they're going to have a harder time in the provinces than in Tehran itself.
Thank you. So going back to basics, what exactly does the high ethnic minority population mean for Iran and the regime?
Baha'i? Did you say?
The high ethnic minority population.
Right. So that's always the question, right? So that's a very important question. That the fact that people are ethnic minorities doesn't necessarily mean that Iran has a political problem, right? A lot of countries are multi-ethnic, and that's actually a very positive aspect of the very a beautiful aspect of these countries, like the United States, for instance. But in Iran, first thing, they suppress the minorities. It's it's not like Canada, Belgium, Switzerland, or where ethnic minorities can use their languages, can teach their children their languages, they mock the ethnic minority. So like if you look at Iranian television and the study that was a trigger to our conversation today, if you look at the simply mocking the ethnic minorities in the Iranian media, somehow it's funny to, call an Iranian Azerbaijani a cockroach, or say that their kids use toilet brushes to brush their teeth, and all these different examples that are in the study, that the regime is difficult for everyone, right? The economic situation is difficult, the corruption there is difficult, the lack of freedom, right? But add to that you don't even get to use your own language, and that you're suppressed as an ethnic minority, and you're poorer than the Persian center, and you have great environmental challenges and degradation, and you go across the border. So a Kurd can go from Iran to Iraqi Kurdistan and see a better situation, see his language can be used. And Azerbaijani can go from Tabriz in Iran to Baku, go have a good time, see people living well. And I think when they compare their situation with co-ethnics in neighboring states, this really does affect the stability of Iran.
Understood. Thank you. From Jerry Danzig, the Baha'is, how do they fit in?
Yeah, so religious minority outside of my expertise. I worked on the ethnic groups. Thank you.
Muted. Of course. So JR Pride asks, in your reference to a Persian language, is that Farsi?
Right. Same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. And what is the nature of the Iranian people? Are they liberal or conservatives? From Carrie.
Difficult to say. I think, in the it's a huge country with a lot of different people. Maybe it's my American education prejudice, but I think when religion and state go together, it's not only bad for the state, it's bad for religion. Generally turns people away from religion, because politics is about competition over resources. Religion's supposed to be about spirit, not about material goods, when you put those together. So I think probably over 40 years of Islamic Republic rule has done a lot to actually hurt the connection to religion in Iran. So, yeah, I think it's a huge country with a lot of very different people and different attitudes.
So along those lines, Wayne Lowe asked, does Islam act as a unifying factor among the minorities with the Persians?
Right. Yeah, I think it doesn't, at least anymore. I think that, the previous regime, the Shah regime, Pahlavi regime, was very Persian centric. You could even say Persian centrist. The whole monarchy idea is about the great Persian nation, right? And ethnic minorities didn't like this. They suffered from them, but there was some consistency in the ideology, right? That it was about a specific ethnic group and its language and its culture. But when the Islamic Republic, which was supposed to be, Islam is a universalist religion, it isn't centered on one ethnic group. When it was supposed to be about Islam, maybe there were some that thought it would give more opportunity for the ethnic minorities. Like, why can't they use their language? If they're Muslims, these languages are not, don't have a hierarchy, of that Persian somehow is above it. And I think for some, in a certain extent, the Islamic Republic, still continuing this Persian-centric ideology, was even more difficult for many of the ethnic minorities. So no, I don't think it's a glue anymore. And also, the minorities can see through this. So let's take, for instance, the Azerbaijanis, a third of the population. Many of them, during this last war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, they felt a great, identification with Azerbaijan. They'd go to the border areas, the battle zone really borders where they live, and they cheer the Azerbaijani soldiers and talk to them and throw candies to them. And when they know their country was supporting Armenia, who's Christian, against Azerbaijani Shia, they know this isn't an Islamic Republic, or Iran, while China is suppressing, a million Uyghur Muslims in the most oppressive ways, hurting women, forcing sterilization, abortion on Muslim women. And to say that this is an Islamic republic, so people know that this is just rhetoric. So I don't think it's a glue, a glue anymore. I mean, they saw, like during this war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Azerbaijanis saw that the arms going to Christians are coming through Iran, right? So they know that Islam is just rhetoric for this regime.
Thank you.
By the way, just to add here that this Israel's support for Azerbaijan in this last war, this last year, that was quite evident, public, and it actually bought Israel a lot of respect or even friendship inside Iran. From again, ethnic Azerbaijanis are a third of the population of Iran.
Thank you, and I'm sure this could take up an entire webinar all in itself, but could you explain why Iran backed Armenia despite having 1/3 population of ethnic Azerbaijanis?
Right. So two major reasons. From the beginning of the Soviet breakup, instead of saying, if you're a real Islamic republic, saying, wow, this is an opportunity, 6 new Muslim majority countries, Central Asia and Azerbaijan even populated by Shia Muslims. This is a great opportunity to extend Islam and Muslim freedom, right? But they, from the beginning, were afraid of the implications for their own domestic stability. And they even said this quite openly in Iranian press. And, instead of celebrating the Soviet breakup, they were very nervous about it. And they, having a big, like Turkmen, not big, but about 2 to 3 million Turkmen in northern Iran over the border from the Turkmenistan, which is a new country, having about 28 million Azerbaijanis and over the border Republic of Azerbaijan. They were very nervous that this would cause some sort of irredentist developments inside Iran, so when this war broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the early 90s, they right away sided with Armenia. And it's, again, pure realpolitik, just in order to keep Azerbaijan involved in a war and not able to, reach out to the community in Iran. And then basically the first war, it was completely sustained by supplies from Iran, and the second, Russian supplies in the second war. So it's really hard to call yourself the Islamic Republic. I mean, like when Iran talks about its support for Palestinians being about Islam, it really doesn't go together with its support for, there are many more Azerbaijani refugees than Palestinian, refugees from the 1948 war. And they had no concern for these refugees that are alive today, Shia. It was interesting today. I just saw on social media that Iranian ambassador to Azerbaijan was attacking the Israeli ambassador to Azerbaijan for talking about the war in Gaza, and I was just that the Israeli ambassador to Azerbaijan is such a Ambassador George Dick, such a popular personality who actually brought in, like, even human eyes donated from Israelis with organ donors in Israel were put in the return site to Azerbaijani soldiers, in Azerbaijan, Israeli doctors. I don't know, he's going to have a hard case outdoing someone who had actually been so active in really helping the society there.
Thank you for that explanation. Stephen Orlow asks, are there any restrictions upon the various minorities as far as entry to higher education, the professions, or military and security services?
That's a good question. Well, first thing, there's the language barrier. So, like, for instance, teachers have to not only be proficient in Persian, they can't have strong accents. So this bars a lot, it doesn't say, well, a Kurdish woman person can't be a teacher, or a Baluch can't be a teacher. But if their language is accented, the Ministry of Education is not supposed to hire them. And so there's more of a push to put native Persians even as teachers in the minority areas. You find, well, some of the ethnic groups, like, for instance, there's never been a Sunni governor in Iran. and under the Islamic Republic. So let's say for Baluch, for most of the Kurds, for half of the Arabs, which are Sunnis, they're barred from being, not by law, but by practice, from being governors. You have in the security services, the army, you have, maybe some of the ethnic minorities are less trusted. Azerbaijanis are somewhat, more trusted than on the other. They're more integrated in the regime. But definitely the language issue, if you think that people, they have to make it up in a system where it's not in their native language, it's a clear barrier.
Understood. Thank you. From Andrew Rosemarine, do any of the minorities have pro-US, pro-British, or pro-Israeli contingents?
So that's a great question. So I encourage you, and maybe I can share through the Middle East Forum, the Gunaz TV in Chicago, that's broadcast from Chicago. It broadcasts into Iran in the ethnic minority languages and also in Persian. And they do these call-in shows that are interactive, and it's very interesting. A couple of the shows in the last couple of weeks. So these are people in Iran calling in, taking huge personal risks. It's clear these calls are monitored. And for instance, they did one show on the US sanctions on Iran. And the Biden administration is saying that we need to remove sanctions for humanitarian reasons. We shouldn't punish the people of Iran, right? And you have people, 50 callers that called in and said, leave the sanctions on. All the money is only going to go to the regime. Even if it was going to go to us, we prefer to suffer and get rid of this regime than have the sanctions removed. There was one show about Israel. What are the attitudes towards Israel? And dozens of callers calling in and saying that we don't, accept the regime's enmity towards Israel. And the ones that are Azerbaijanis were saying openly, again, on open phone lines to a TV station that that they know that Israel helps Azerbaijan while Iran, helps their enemies. And so yeah, I think the ethnic minorities definitely have different attitudes, and probably all of the Iranians, a lot of Iranians, regardless of ethnic minorities, actually would prefer the sanctions to stay on. This is just propaganda of the pro-regime lobby in the United States, and they prefer sanctions. Just like Nelson Mandela called for sanctions to stay on, and not and even if it hurt the people of South Africa on a day-to-day basis.
Wonderful, thank you. Jerry Weiner asked, do ethnic minorities tend to align cooperatively in opposition to the 50% who control the power, or are they disorganized as individual groups?
Okay, Jerry, that's a really important question, and I'll give two parts to it. So inside Iran, one, in many of the areas, the ethnic minority areas are mixed. So like, let's say areas where Azerbaijanis and Kurds live, Arabs and Lurs live. So yes, there is somewhat of this competition between the groups and not always cooperation. The regime also is very successful in playing the groups against each other. In my study, I talked with people about the policing. And so for instance, in the Kurdish areas, they generally use police that are ethnic Azerbaijani, so that the minorities think of not as the bad Persian cop, but the bad, Azerbaijani cop. The governors, like for instance in the Ahwaz area, are usually Lurs and not Persians. So that again, like if you're upset with what the regime's doing, you're upset against the Lur and not the Persian. So they try to really play the groups against each other, and some happens on their own, without the regime playing it. A bigger problem of contention is that most of the, what we would call the mainstream, opposition, which many of you, friends and colleagues in the United States, whether it's the monarchists or democracy movements, they want democracy, and they want democracy for Iran on, let's say, women's issues and freedom of religion. But very few of the groups are even willing to discuss any rights for the ethnic minorities. And I think the regime really successfully plays, the opposition against the ethnic groups as well, and says, either you stay with us or you risk losing, territory. So that, look at the Soviet example, when Moscow didn't have its grip, Russia lost its empire. I think the Russians handled that pretty gracefully. Mostly the Russian population, accepted the loss of empire, and even some intellectuals saw an advantage in it. But I think that Iranian mainstream opposition, and you can ask, probably maybe we even have on the calls, some colleagues, is not interested in granting minority rights to the ethnic minorities. I think that until this issue is solved, until the ethnic minorities and the mainstream opposition find some kind of model where everyone can have their rights fulfilled in a minimal but meaningful way, I think the regime will not have a united front against it.
Thank you. And the last question is from Taffy Gould. What are the implications for the future of Iran?
I think are the ethnic minorities going to bring the regime down? I'm not sure, especially, like I said, with this schism with the mainstream opposition. But in an all-out crisis, I think they could push the thing over the top. And we saw this like with the Soviet Union. The ethnic minorities didn't start the fall of the Soviet Union. They joined it, and then they pushed, the ball down. They pushed the snowball to get bigger and bigger. If we look at every time in the 20th century when Tehran was weak, whether it was, because of domestic revolutions, domestic challenges, the ethnic minorities rose up and asked for their rights. The last time was also during the Islamic Revolution. We had these real rebellions in Tabriz and Marabat, the Kurdish areas. And the ethnic minorities initially supported, or large numbers of them initially supported Khomeini because he had promised to grant them language rights and rights for their schools, and just did a little trick, got them, enticed them in. And when the draft constitution came out, boom, no language rights, no ethnic rights. So I think in a regime crisis, this pushes things over the edge. I don't know if it's enough to bring down the Islamic Republic on its own.
Understood. Thank you. And before we go, can you just tell our viewers where we can find some more of your work?
Oh, thank you. So this latest report, Iran is More Than Persia, is on the website of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I'm currently there conducting a research project on ethnic minorities in Iran and writing a book about the topic. And there's an earlier book from MIT Press, Borders and Brethren, Iran and the Challenge of Azerbaijani Identity. This goes deep into the issue of the split Azerbaijani minority between Iran and the Republic of Azerbaijan, and how this and how the independence of Republic of Azerbaijan affected ethnic identity in Iran. And so thank you so much, Stacey, for hosting this today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Shaffer, for taking time to speak with us today. We've come to the close of our webinar. For our viewers and listeners, please be on the lookout for our weekly webinar offerings email coming out over the weekend. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.